Chapter 10 Brother I'm Dying by Edwiges Danticat, titled Gypsy. Our new home was a two-bedroom apartment on the 6th floor of a 6-story brick building in a cul-de-sac off Flatbush Avenue called Westbury Court. Beneath the building ran a subway station through which rattled the D, M, and Q trains at all hours, day and night. At first sight, my parents' living room seemed lavish and plush with its beige wall-to-wall carpeting, its velour-upholstered sofas and chairs covered in plastic for their protection, and the diagonal mirror cutouts framing a giant velvet print of the Last Supper. I mistook their fire escape, which extended from my parents' bedroom window to the living rooms, for an outdoor terrace, and immediately began to imagine all of us spending summer evenings out there, looking over the neighborhood while sipping American colas and telling each other stories. Don't, and I mean don't, ever go out there, was the first thing my father said to Bob and me after he'd shown us the living room. Kelly and Carl already know this. It's where the firemen come if there's a fire and they need to save your lives. He was speaking as though he was already saving our lives by giving us that most helpful order. I pressed my fingers against the accordion bars on the windows, watching my dreams of spending evenings floating above Brooklyn evaporate. My brothers, whom my mother had gone and picked up at her friend's down the hall, bounced into the room, eager to see us. They were, of course, bigger. Kelly, a gangling 7-year-old, and Carl, a much stouter 5. Carl immediately ran up to me, nearly knocking me off my feet as he wrapped his arms around my hips and squeezed as hard as he could. Looking up, with a broad, crooked smile, he asked, "Are you really my sister?" I wasn't used to hugs. It wasn't really part of my daily interactions, even with the people I love most, but I let my hands fall on his shoulders and stroked his back. Looking down at him, I wondered if my mother had told him about the time we'd first met, he a baby in my arms. Or did he instinctively know that we were supposed to love one another? My parents were looking on, both with big grins on their contented faces. They were perhaps moved, amused, pleased that Carl had what could only be called a deep sense of thoughtfulness. Over the years, I would grow to get used to it. I'd even count on it. He was often the first to offer a chair to someone who was standing, start a conversation with someone who seemed shy. He was the person to call immediately when something terrible happened. But back then, his attempt at a hug felt like more. It was, and still remains, the best welcome I had ever felt in my life. It felt like love. "Of course she's your sister," my mother answered when I didn't. Her hand pressed against Kelly's back. She was nudging him forward, toward us, but he stood in place, watching Bob. My father's arm was resting on Bob's shoulder, and he, too, was trying to move him toward Kelly. "Why don't you show your brother one of your toys?" my father told Kelly. Kelly's face brightened. He motioned for Bob to follow him. Bob looked up from my father for confirmation, then slowly marched behind Kelly, disappearing down the narrow hallway that led to the bedrooms. They were barely gone for a minute when my mother called them back. "Vinny, come, food." She motioned for us all to move to the kitchen, where the stovetop was crowded with pots and pans. In a corner across from the refrigerator was a small table and 4 chairs. Since she and my father and the boys had already eaten, she filled 2 plates with food and put them down in front of Bob and me. Carl was still holding on, slipping onto my lap as I ate my rice and beans, stewed chicken, fried plantains, and meatballs. "I helped cook that," my father said proudly. "It's your welcome repast." Kelly was watching us with his chin pressed down on the table. Bob ate quickly and asked for more. I wanted to kick him under the table. "They'll think you haven't eaten since they left you," I hissed. "Let the boy eat," my father said, and laughed. He was leaning against the wall, watching as my mother ladled more food onto Bob's plate. It wasn't so much that Bob was hungry, I knew. He wanted to please them. He frankly wanted them to be happy, and feeding him was making them happy. I stuffed my mouth but didn't swallow right away. I didn't want them to ask me any questions. I didn't want to have to answer anything. Once we were done eating, Bob ran all over the apartment with Kelly showing him where everything was. Eventually, Carl slipped away and joined them. My father followed. My mother showed me where we were sleeping, in the 2nd bedroom, the one overlooking the train tracks. Aside from the wall with a line of ribbon windows, every other wall had a bed pressed against it. I had inherited a full-size bed from my mother's sister, Tante Grace, who had been living with my parents before we came. Kelly and Carl shared a metal bunk bed with Kelly sleeping on top and Carl at the bottom. Bob's bed was a twin-sized cot, but had the advantage of being closest to the 12-inch television that stood on top of a wooden dresser. "Do you want to go to sleep?" my mother asked. I nodded, adding, yes. She had already placed a flannel nightgown on the bed for me. When I went to the bathroom to brush my teeth, my brothers were there. "I'm so glad you guys can speak Creole," Bob was saying to them. They were already a trio, a team. The bed smelled of citronella and vetiver, of getting dressed and going out rather than of falling asleep. The scent, I would later learn, was a brand of fabric softener. Liline was probably sleeping on my mattress right now, I thought, taking a break from her own smelly one. How could this vetiver smelling and citronella scented bed, I wonder, ever really be mine? My parents turned off the lights and left the four of us in the dark. A few minutes later, I heard their muffled laughter coming from the next room, as well as the occasional sound of our names. They were already telling each other stories about us. "Do you see how much Bob can eat?" asked my mother. "Did you see how Carl wouldn't let Edwige go?" asked my father. "I don't think Kelly's quite sure what's going on." Somewhere below us, the train would clatter by, drowning their voices, and then there would be only silence again. In the dark, Kelly, whose Creole was a bit halting but clear, whispered, "Are you guys adopted?" "No," answered Bob. "They say you two are older than me," he continued, "but it's not true. I'm the oldest." Kelly's words reminded me of a puzzling, until now, story that Grandma Melina used to tell about a young, mischievous billy goat who came across an old, decrepit, and hairless horse on a narrow trail one day. Blocking the ancient horse's path, the youthful goat said, "You should let me go first, because I'm older than you." "You should let me go first," replied the old horse, "because I'm truly older." "Can't you see I have a beard and you don't?" replied the bouncy goat, laughing. "Aren't beards a sign of old age?" Kelly's time with our parents was his beard. Indeed, he had spent much more time with them than Bob and I had combined. How much had he and Carl been prepared? I wondered. Had my parents ever spoken to them about us? Had they even told them we were coming until today? Later, they would both tell me that it was as though we'd dropped out of the sky. They had no memories of their trip to Haiti, and my parents had told them nothing. A fear, perhaps, as in the letters, of shattering all the hearts involved. "I'll tell you a secret," Bob whispered back to Kelly in the dark. "We're really spies from outer space. We have spy stuff inserted into our heads." I was continually amazed by Bob's pool of knowledge. Where had he learned this? From comic books that only he and Nick read? Tales that only the two of them had told each other? The next morning, before our parents woke up, Carl got out of bed and crawled into mine. His fire engine-covered pajamas also smelled like citronella and vetiver. I was beginning to think that all of America would. Carl was kneeling and had to press his hands against the wall to keep his balance as he leaned down to kiss my forehead. "It must hurt where you have all that spy stuff in your head," he said, raising himself up again. "It does," I said, feeling myself on the verge of tears. Soon after he got up, Kelly climbed on the kitchen counter and found a butter knife, which he carried back to the room. "I can get the spy stuff out for you guys," he said, smirking as though to prove that he was not only the oldest but the smartest. "You can't do it," Bob said, closing his eyes slowly, to slowly massage the side of his face. "No one can. What I can do is to make us really brothers and sisters is to ask my friends from space to put in one of your heads, too, while you're sleeping tonight. Then we can talk more easily with each other without even speaking. Do you agree?" Kelly lowered the butter knife and pursed his lips. Carl looked up at my head as if searching for some clue, some sign of disfiguration, which he might also have to carry for the rest of his life. "Okay, then," Kelly said. "Okay," echoed Carl. From that day on, we considered ourselves full brothers and sister. I still marveled how Bob, then only 10 years old, thought of all this, but as strange as it seems, he truly gelled us, started us on our way to becoming a family. That morning, while our new blood and spy brothers were introducing us to Saturday morning cartoons, my father, still in his pajamas, carried in what looked like a large black handbag with a small silver latch, and laid it carefully on my bed. And though his face was crumpled and there was sleep in his eyes, he seemed eager for me to open it. Grabbing the latch, I forced it apart, nearly smashing it. My brothers turned their eyes away from the television to watch me run my fingers over my welcome gift. It was a typewriter, a Smith Corona Corsair portable manual. Once more, tears gathered in my eyes before I even had time to think of something to say. I remembered asking my father in one of my letters to send me a typewriter. The tellers at the uncle's bank had them. The clerks at the education ministry had. I'd asked my father for one because I thought my uncle should have one too, not only for his school and church work, but to write back to my father. Looking down at the perfect beige keys lined up like big ivory teeth, I couldn't help but feel that I'd received the typewriter too late. What would I do with a typewriter all to myself? Then in a flash it occurred to me that I could write to my uncle hundreds and hundreds of letters to impress him with my new skills, my new knowledge, my new life. "This will help you measure your words," my father said, tapping the keys with his fingers for emphasis, to line them up neatly. He meant this literally. He and I both had slightly crooked cursive handwriting. Unlike him, however, I would often line up my pens against a ruler to help to keep a straight line. Still, they feel like such prescient gifts now, this typewriter and his desire very early on to see me properly assemble my words. In the end, after becoming better acquainted with the machine, I pecked out only one letter to Uncle Joseph. It was brief, telling him that Bob and I were all right, were getting along fine with our parents and brothers, and were thinking of him and Tante Denise, Nick and Liline, Tante Z, Tante Tina, Marie Micheline, and Ruth, and everyone else. My letter was really a list of names, an inventory of the people whose faces popped into my head every day and whose voices echoed in my ear every night. My uncle did not write back, perhaps wanting to allow us some distance, some time to merge into our family without any meddling from him. He had written to my father, however, sending him a note whenever a friend traveled from Haiti to New York. After reading his notes, my father would always tell us that my uncle had told him to say hello to Edwige, Bob, Kelly, and Carl. Were Bob and I no longer special to him, I wondered? No longer worth setting apart? There's a Haitian saying, "Petit mot se lave yon beau kite yon beau." When you bathe other people's children, it says, you should wash one side and leave the other side dirty. I suppose this saying cautions those who care for other people's children not to give over their whole hearts, because they will never get a whole heart back. I wonder if after we left for New York, my uncle felt that way. A few years ago, I discovered, when lost again, a few lines I had typed in red ink a couple summers after we arrived in New York. "My father's cab is named for wanderers, drifters, nomads. It's called a gypsy cab." Unlike a yellow cab, a gypsy has no medallions or affiliations. It belongs entirely to the driver, who roams the streets all day looking for fares. Every Saturday morning after we arrived, my father left home extra early at 4 or 5 a.m. to roam for fares. "Be careful," my mother called out after him with sleep in her voice. Stirred awake by the shuffle of both their feet, my brothers and I wanted to call out, "Be careful," but we didn't, because it would have worried my father to think that we too were fretting about him. After my father left the apartment, my mother would rush back to her room to open the window over the fire escape and watch him start his motor and pull away. My brothers and I would have liked to do this too, but our window did not face the street, and it would have troubled our mother to know that we were also worried about our father. Once, while working very early on a Saturday morning, my father cut in front of some teenagers in a stolen van, and they shot 3 bullets at his car. He had a passenger dozing off in the back, and miraculously neither he nor the passenger was hurt. He never told us these types of things directly. Instead, he recounted what my brothers and I called his street adventures at the Monday night prayer meetings, where families took turns gathering at one another's houses each week. "Even my family hasn't heard this," he would begin. "I didn't want to worry them." Another Saturday morning, 3 men held a gun to his head and forced him to drive to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where they asked him to give them all the money he had in the car. When they found out he had only a few dollars in his pocket, they hit him in his face with a crowbar and ran away. His face was bruised, black and blue and swollen, but given the circumstances, he made out okay, which is exactly what he told the prayer group the following Monday. I was only in the emergency room a few hours, most of the time waiting for a doctor to see me. Given the circumstances, I made out okay. Once in a while, throughout my teens, I'd find myself riding in the front seat as my father picked up fares. Often he was taking me somewhere, but picked up the fare anyways. One afternoon, an old man called my father a stupid idiot because my father had mistaken one street for another. Another time, my father picked up a woman who, when he asked her to repeat her address, shouted at the top of her voice, "No one who drives a cab speaks English anymore." My father rarely talked back. What would be the use? He would say, "I need their money more than they need my service." Every now and then a passenger would arrive at his or her destination, open the door, and run into a building without paying. Others would say they were going to get money and never come back. My father never went after them. His crowbar and gunshot encounters had taught him that something much worse than getting stiffed might be lying in wait. Yet another Saturday morning, when I was 14, as my father was driving me to an extra tutorial at school, I began to ask myself what type of work I wanted to do. Would I be a doctor, lawyer, engineer, as most Haitian adults, including my parents, hoped their children would be, or would I do something else? "Do you ever wish you could do something other than drive your cab?" I asked my father. "Sure," he answered. I thought I saw his hands shaking, his lips quivering. He bit down on the lower one, hard, to make the trembling stop. He probably thought I was judging him, telling him what he was doing was not honorable, prestigious, intelligent enough. However, having started, I couldn't stop. "What would you do if you weren't driving a cab?" I asked, watching his grip tighten on the wheel. He stared ahead at the busy street as though it were a screen onto which he would project his life. Had his parents wished him to be a doctor, lawyer, or engineer, a farmer, a fighter? Had he nursed some other dream for himself? "If I could do something else," my father finally said, "I'd be either a grocer or an undertaker, because we all must eat and we all must die."